What if a band sold over 20 million records and almost nobody outside Canada remembers their name? What if they outsold contemporaries, headlined arenas from coast to coast, cracked the American top 20, earned platinum certifications in the United States, and still ended up filed under forgotten? They packed stadiums. They shared stages with Rush, Journey, and Styx, bands that went on to become rock legends. They had a song that stayed on the Billboard Hot 100 for 16 consecutive weeks. MTV played their videos. American radio loved them. And then, silence. Decades later, most music fans couldn't tell you a single April Wine song, couldn't name a single member, couldn't tell you where they came from, what they built, or why it collapsed. But here's the thing that makes this story haunting. It wasn't addiction that destroyed them. It wasn't a legendary feud. It wasn't a lawsuit that tore the band apart. It was something quieter, something more insidious. It was the music industry itself and the invisible wall that has always stood between Canadian artists and permanent American rock immortality. This is the story of April Wine, the band that did everything right, won every battle, and somehow still lost the war. Before we start, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Before the arenas, before the platinum records, before America ever heard their name, there was a small town in Nova Scotia called Waverley, just outside Halifax. If you've never heard of it, that's exactly the point. It's the kind of place where big dreams feel almost embarrassing to say out loud. It was 1969. The world was exploding with music. The Beatles were fracturing, Led Zeppelin was rising, Cream had already come and gone, and four young men in a quiet maritime town decided they were going to do something that almost nobody from that corner of Canada had ever done before. They were going to become rock stars. Myles Goodwyn, David Henman, Jim Henman, and Ritchie Henman. The Henman brothers and their cousin formed the nucleus of what would become one of Canada's most successful rock exports in history. David and Ritchie were brothers. Jim was their cousin, and Myles Goodwyn, quiet, disciplined, intensely focused, was the visionary who would hold the whole thing together for the next 5 decades. Their first official rehearsal took place on December 1st, 1969. Mark that date, because what started in a Nova Scotia rehearsal room that winter would eventually fill the largest concert venues in North America. But even then, as they played their first chords together in the cold Atlantic winter, the seeds of an impossible challenge were already planted. They were Canadian. They were from the Maritimes, not even Toronto, not Montreal. And in the music industry of 1969, that meant starting 10 steps behind everyone else. The warning signs were already there. They just didn't know it yet. The first move was the right one. Get out. In 1970, April Wine packed up and relocated from Nova Scotia to Montreal. It was the band's first act of ambition, trading the comfortable obscurity of the Maritimes for the competitive, bilingual music scene of Quebec. Montreal in 1970 was alive with creative energy, a city that felt more connected to the wider world than anywhere else in Canada at the time. And it worked, almost immediately. They signed with Aquarius Records, a relationship that would anchor much of their classic era. And in 1971, their self-titled debut album arrived, recorded at RCA Studios in Montreal. The band that had rehearsed in a Nova Scotia living room 2 years earlier now had a record on shelves. Fast Train became their first significant radio hit. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it established something crucial. Myles Goodwyn could write songs that people wanted to hear. He was already emerging as the band's primary songwriter, the creative engine around which everything else would revolve. Then came the first lineup change, and it would not be the last. Jim Henman left the band in 1971. Jim Clench stepped in on bass, and with Jim Henman's departure, Goodwyn stepped fully into the role of lead vocalist. The original family lineup was already beginning to transform, but what they were building was extraordinary. They wanted to prove that Canadian rock could stand toe-to-toe with anything coming out of Britain or the United States. They wanted to be taken seriously, not as a regional act, not as a novelty, but as a genuine rock band competing on the world stage. And what happened next changed everything. The breakthrough came in 1972 with their second album, On Record. Producer Ralph Murphy helped them find a sound that was cleaner, more radio-friendly, and built for mass consumption. Then came You Could Have Been a Lady. The song was originally recorded by Hot Chocolate, a British pop act. April Wine took it, stripped it down, plugged it in, and turned it into something harder and more urgent. It reached #1 in Canada. Then it crossed the border and entered the American Billboard Top 40, where it remained for 11 consecutive weeks. 11 weeks on the American charts, for a band from Waverly, Nova Scotia. They weren't done. Bad Side of the Moon, originally written by Elton John and Bernie Taupin, became another successful single from the same album. April Wine was proving something important. They could take other people's songs and make them definitively their own. But more importantly, they were beginning to develop something that would define their entire career. A live show that was impossible to ignore. By 1973, Electric Jewels arrived, and here the band underwent its most significant transformation yet. David and Ritchie Henman both departed. The original family unit, the core of the Waverly rehearsal room, was gone. In came guitarist Gary Moffat and drummer Jerry Mercer, who would become one of the band's most recognizable musicians and one of the defining forces behind their arena sound. The Electric Adventure Tour followed. And this is where April Wine stopped being a Canadian recording act and started becoming something else entirely. A live phenomenon. Major lighting rigs. Pyrotechnics, a production designed for rooms far larger than they were currently playing. Weeping Widow, Lady Run, Lady Hide. Songs that connected with audiences in a visceral, physical way. April Wine wasn't making music for listening rooms. They were building an act for arenas, and the arenas were coming. Stand Back arrived in 1975 and went double platinum in Canada. Tonight is a wonderful time to fall in love. I wouldn't want to lose your love. Ooh, what tonight? Come hear the band. These weren't just songs, they were anthems. The kind of tracks that a crowd of 20,000 people sings back to the stage. Steve Lang came in on bass, replacing Jim Clench. The lineup was stabilizing. The machine was working. Then The Whole World's Going Crazy in 1976 made history. It became the first album by a Canadian band to receive platinum advance orders. Before a single copy hit shelves, it had already gone platinum. It reached #1 in Canada. Let that land. #1 in Canada. Platinum before release. But beneath the success, something dangerous was growing. An invisible ceiling that no Canadian band had yet figured out how to break through permanently. The success was real. The momentum was undeniable. But the music industry has always been a geography game, and the geography was working against April Wine in ways they couldn't fully control. Forever For Now arrived in 1977. You Won't Dance With Me went gold in Canada. The album went gold. Everything was moving upward. And then came the El Mocambo incident, one of the strangest and most telling moments in the band's entire history. The Rolling Stones secretly performed at a small Toronto club called El Mocambo, listing themselves on the bill as the Cockroaches. April Wine was listed as the headliner, the advertised act, to keep the real attraction secret. Think about that for a moment. April Wine was used as cover for the Rolling Stones. They were prominent enough to sell tickets without raising suspicion, but not so famous that their name would tip anyone off that something bigger was happening. It was a compliment and a quiet humiliation wrapped in the same story. Live at the El Mocambo captured some of this energy, including the crowd favorite She's No Angel. The band's reputation as a live act was growing internationally. They were undeniably real, but here's the pattern that was beginning to emerge. And this is the hidden crack at the center of April Wine's story. The album sold millions in Canada, but resentment, not within the band but within the industry, began to fester. Resentment at the invisible wall between Canadian success and American rock immortality. The tours expanded, but exhaustion deepened. Lineup changes kept coming. Not explosive, dramatic departures, but the slow, grinding attrition of a band that was always working, always touring, always building, but never quite breaking through in the one market that determined legacy. The fame increased in Canada, but the relationship with the American market stayed complicated, transactional, conditional, and it was about to destroy everything they had built, or almost everything. First Glance arrived in 1978, and with it, the American breakthrough that April Wine had been chasing for nearly a decade. Roller became their breakthrough American hit, not because of a marketing campaign, not because of a label push, because a radio station in Flint, Michigan started playing it, and listeners couldn't get enough. Grassroots, organic, real. Roller entered the U.S. Top 40. First Glance became their first gold album outside Canada. It appeared on the Billboard album chart. And suddenly, finally, the invitations started arriving. Rush requested April Wine as an opening act. Journey invited them on major shows. Styx shared stages with them. These weren't minor support slots. These were the biggest rock acts in the world at the time, and they wanted April Wine on their bills. This was the moment. This was supposed to be the permanent crossing. Harder, Faster in 1979 was the proof of concept. The album had a harder edge, leaning into the arena rock sound that American audiences were consuming in enormous quantities. I Like to Rock became one of the band's signature songs. Say Hello was another major hit. Harder, Faster stayed on the Billboard album chart for approximately 40 weeks. It went platinum in Canada. It went gold in the United States. Gold in the United States. April Wine was headlining major American venues. They toured the States with Nazareth. Promoters were treating them as headliners, not support acts. After a decade of work, they had arrived. And then came The Nature of the Beast in 1981. The album that should have cemented everything, Just Between You and Me, became their biggest American hit. It reached the Billboard Top 20. It stayed on the Hot 100 for 16 weeks. 16 weeks. MTV picked up the video and exposed the band to an entirely new generation of American viewers. Sign of the Gypsy Queen became another major hit. The Nature of the Beast went platinum in the United States. Over 1 million copies sold in America alone. The band toured Canada, the United States, England, and Germany. They were, by any reasonable measure, an international rock act. But here's where the disaster arc begins. Not with a single catastrophic event, but with the slow, grinding machinery of timing. The problem wasn't that April Wine failed. The problem was that they succeeded at exactly the wrong moment. By 1981, the American rock landscape was shifting. MTV wasn't just exposing acts like April Wine, it was creating entirely new ones. Acts with looks, concepts, production values that were built for television. Bands that had been grinding on the road for a decade were suddenly competing with acts that had been assembled in boardrooms with a visual aesthetic in mind. Power Play came in 1982, Animal Grace in 1984, Walking Through Fire in 1985. Each album found the band working harder to maintain ground that was eroding beneath their feet. The internal pressures were building, the changing musical landscape was hostile. Hair metal was consuming the charts. Synth pop was conquering radio. April Wine, a band built on guitar-driven, road-tested, honest rock and roll, was watching their moment pass. The tours continued, but the rooms got smaller. The radio support softened. The momentum that had taken 12 years to build began to reverse. The dream, as they had built it, was over. By the mid-1980s, April Wine entered a lengthy hiatus. There was no dramatic public implosion, no lawsuit splashed across the front pages, no notorious moment that the music press could turn into a cautionary tale. That's almost the saddest part. When bands collapse in fire, when there are fistfights and betrayals and legendary feuds, at least the story survives. At least people remember why they fell apart. April Wine didn't end in fire. They faded. And in the music industry, fading is the worst possible outcome, because it gives historians nothing to grip, no villain to assign, no moment to replay. 11 Juno nominations over the course of their career. 11 nominations for Canada's most prestigious music award, and not a single win. Never once. Not in the years when they were selling out arenas. Not when they went platinum in America. Not ever. The band that received platinum advance orders. The band that opened for Rush. The band with a song on the Billboard Hot 100 for 16 weeks. Never won a Juno. If you needed a single statistic to explain why April Wine ended up as one of rock's great forgotten acts, that might be it. But that wasn't the end. Rock and roll has always had a stubborn refusal to stay dead. And April Wine, led by the iron will of Myles Goodwyn, was not finished. They reunited in the early 1990s. In 1993, Attitude arrived. A new album, a new chapter. A band that had survived the collapse of their commercial peak and found a reason to keep playing. And this second chapter revealed something important about what April Wine actually was, something that all the chart positions and album certifications had partly obscured. They weren't a phenomenon created by industry machinery. They were a live band, a touring band, a band whose audience wasn't built on trend cycles, but on the kind of loyalty that only comes from seeing a group play their hearts out night after night in cities large and small across 2 countries. The reunion showed that the audience hadn't disappeared. They'd just been waiting. Years later, another chapter would begin, one written in halls of honor rather than hit parades. In 2009, the Canadian music industry inducted April Wine into their Hall of Fame. In 2010, the following year, they were inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. Consecutive years. Back-to-back recognition for a band that had spent the better part of 2 decades being overlooked by the very institutions now celebrating them. Better late than never, but late enough to sting. So what did April Wine leave behind? First, a blueprint. They were among the first Canadian rock acts to demonstrate that it was possible to build a genuinely international career from a Canadian base. Not just in the pop market, but in hard rock, the genre that American audiences treated as their own private territory. Before April Wine, the conventional wisdom was that Canadian rock bands could be massive at home and invisible everywhere else. April Wine cracked that wall, even if they couldn't demolish it entirely. Second, the songs. I Like to Rock, Just Between You and Me, Sign of the Gypsy Queen, Roller, You Could Have Been a Lady. These aren't relics. These are legitimately great rock songs that hold up against anything that came out of the classic arena rock era. The fact that they're unknown to most contemporary rock listeners says nothing about their quality and everything about the geography of musical memory. Third, the live reputation. Ask anyone who saw April Wine at their peak. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, they were one of the most powerful live acts in rock. The lighting, the pyrotechnics, the sheer ferocity of a band that had spent a decade building their show from the ground up, one city at a time. And then there is Myles Goodwyn, the man at the center of all of it. Goodwyn was the band's vocalist, guitarist, and principal songwriter from the very beginning. He survived every lineup change, every commercial disappointment, every industry slight, every missed award. He kept April Wine alive through a hiatus, a reunion, a second career, and into a new century. He was the constant, the through line in a story that could easily have ended a dozen different times. In December 2023, Myles Goodwyn died. The central creative force behind April Wine, the man who had turned a Nova Scotia rehearsal room into an international rock career spanning more than 50 years, was gone. April Wine continues to perform, carrying the name forward, but the voice that started everything on December 1st, 1969, is silent now. We started by asking a question. What if a band did everything right, built the catalog, put in the work, earned the audience, cracked the American market, went platinum in the United States, and still ended up forgotten? And the answer, it turns out, is April Wine. But here's what that story actually teaches us. And it's not the lesson you'd expect. The lesson isn't about failure. April Wine didn't fail. They succeeded enormously by almost any reasonable measure. The lesson is about what the music industry actually rewards, and what it doesn't. It rewards timing. It rewards geography. It rewards the narrative around a band as much as, sometimes more than, the music itself. April Wine had the music. They had the live show. They had the work ethic. What they lacked was the story that the American market needed to build them into legends. Led Zeppelin had the mystique. Van Halen had the spectacle. The Doors had the mythology. April Wine had something perhaps more valuable in the real world, but less valuable in the business of legend making. They were consistently excellent. And consistently excellent is, somehow, not always enough. There's something in that worth sitting with. A band from Waverley, Nova Scotia, a place that almost nobody has ever heard of, built a 50-year career on the strength of their music and their relentless refusal to stop. They played the game better than most of the bands who became legends. They just didn't have the benefit of the narrative that turns a rock band into mythology. What if the greatest tragedy in rock and roll isn't dying young? What if it's living long enough to be forgotten, despite having done everything right? That's the real story of April Wine, and that's why it matters. What's your first memory of April Wine? Drop it in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from rock history, the bands that built the music you love and never got the credit they deserved, subscribe, because we're just getting started.